The Justified Beliefs podcast is meant to be educational, informative, and engaging. Many different opposing religious views and various controversial topics will be discussed on this podcast. This podcast is not meant to belittle or offend anyone or their beliefs. This podcast is meant for a mature audience. If views expressed on this podcast and opinions expressed on this podcast upset you or send you in a downward spiral of anger, I kindly suggest you stop listening. Hey guys, welcome back to Justified Belief Podcast. I'm your host, Luca. So this episode, we're continuing down our pathway here of, our apologetics. If you're listening to just the audio portion of this episode, you're still going to get a lot out of it, but I do recommend when you have the time, check out the video portion too, just to visually see, some of these artifacts and some of these documents that I'm going to be sharing with you guys, but I'll still be reading them for my podcast listeners. So like I said, you're not gonna miss anything terribly important. It's all gonna be shared for both visual and audio listeners. Before we jump into that, as always, I just want to put out there, if you enjoy what you're hearing and you like the podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe on whatever audio platform you're listening to. And if you ever want to, have a discussion or share your beliefs or why you believe what you believe, or just general comments and concerns, feel free to send me an email at justifiedbelief@gmail.com. And as always, if you guys ever want to use any of these PowerPoints and any of this information to share with your friends or just for your own personal knowledge, it is all free at my Patreon. You do not need to be a paid subscriber to get this information. You just make a free account. So enough about that. We're going to jump right in. This one is going to be about biblical archaeology and evidence for the Bible. Because, more often than not, a lot of people will hear folks kind of say that there's no archaeological evidence to support the Bible or anything in it. That is just a blatant lie, and we're going to see that as we hop right in here right now. So I'd like to share with you guys a quote before we get started, and it starts like this. There is no archaeological evidence to support the Bible. This is a quote by biblical experts on the internet circa 33 AD to now. So the things I'm going to share with you guys today are not in any particular order. There is a bunch of archaeology to support biblical events. The ones I'm sharing with you are just a few that I found really interesting, and that are kind of my favorites. So the way it starts is we're going to jump into like the papyrus laden, which is also known as the Ipuwer Papyrus, and I'll explain more what this is as we get to them. We're going to talk about the Pilate stone, Pilate's ring, the Taylor prism, the seal of Hezekiah, the Moabite stone, the Nazareth House, the pool of Salome, and then a really interesting and controversial one is the discovery of Crucifixion Nails. And for all my bookworms out there, I do recommend, when you have the time, check out a book called Exodus, Myth or History by a guy named David Roll. It's a really interesting book. I do appreciate David's objectiveness when he writes the book. I don't believe he's an atheist. He may be agnostic. When he wrote the book, he was one or the other. I can't recall at this time. But he presents the information in a very objective way. And he's very careful about, sharing any type of bias he may or may not have. So it's a really good book. And it's interesting to see some of the things he brings up as far as like Egyptology and what some hieroglyphs actually say, and how some hieroglyphics in Egypt actually recorded the enslavement and the exodus of the Hebrews at the time. So definitely check it out. It's a really good read. So the first thing we're going to jump into is what's called the Ipuwer Papyrus. So it was discovered in 1828. The papyrus itself is dated around 1400 BC, which is close to the time of the Exodus. It was written by an Egyptian sage named Ipuwer, and basically what it is it's his description of some tumultuous times in Egypt. But the interesting thing, going with the date of when it was dated and when it was believed that the Hebrews did a mass migration out of Egypt, along with the 10 plagues recorded in the Bible. There's a lot of interesting similarities and parallels that we're going to jump into. So the 10 plagues in Exodus, for those of you who may or may not know, you have the Nile River turning into blood, raining frogs, gnats or lice, flies, the mass death of livestock, boils, hailfire, locusts, thick darkness during the day, and then, of course, the death of the firstborn. And when you guys have a chance, definitely read the full Exodus story and compare it with the Ipuwer Papyrus. There's more similarities than just what we're going to go through today. I just didn't want the list to be too lengthy. So the first section we're going to go over is from the Ipuwer Papyrus side. We have this writing. It says, "Plague is throughout the land. Blood is everywhere. The river is blood. Men shrink from tasting human beings and thirst after water. That is our water. That is our happiness. What shall we do in respect thereof? All is ruin." And now we're going to compare it to the Exodus passage where it says, "All the waters of the river were turned to blood. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, and the river stank. And all the Egyptians dug around the river for water to drink, for they could not drink of the water of the river." Now back on the papyrus side, "Forsooth, gates, columns, and walls are consumed by fire. Lower Egypt weeps. The entire palace is without its revenues. To it belong by right wheat and barley, geese and fish. Forsooth, grain has perished on every side. Forsooth, that has perished which was yesterday seen. The land is left over to its weariness like the cutting of flax." So again, so now this is discussing, the famine and all the problems with the food and basically their staple crops. So now on the Exodus side, "And the fire ran along the ground. There was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous. And the hail smote every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. And the flax and the barley were smitten. For the barley was in season, the flax was ripe, but the wheat and the rye were not smitten, for they were not grown up. There remained no green things in the trees or in the herbs of the field through all the land of Egypt." So just already, it's really interesting to see these parallels. And, keep in mind, this papyrus was, again, written by an Egyptian sage, not an Israelite, not a member of Hebrew culture or society. So it's really cool just to see these parallels, and they're very similar. So, continuing on, again, from the papyrus side, "All animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan. Behold, cattle are left to stray, and there is none to gather them together." And now from Exodus, "The hand of the Lord is upon thy cattle, which is in the field, and there shall be a very grievous sickness. Gather thy cattle and all that thou hast in the field. And he that did not fear the word of the Lord left his servants and cattle in the field. The land is without light, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt." And the last section here. So from the papyrus, "Forsooth, the children of princes are dashed against walls. Forsooth, the children of princes are cast out in the streets. The prison is ruined. He who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. It is groaning throughout the land, mingled with lamentations." So now it's talking about all the kids who died, all the sons, all the families burying their dead. So now from Exodus, "And it came to pass that at midnight the Lord smote all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sat on his throne to the firstborn of the captive that was in prison. There was not a house where there was not one dead. There was a great cry in Egypt." Now the last one, "Behold, the fire has mounted up on high. Its burning goes against the enemies of the land." And now from Exodus, "By day in a pillar of cloud to lead them away, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, to go by day and night." And that's referencing the Hebrews leaving, and God was appearing to them as a pillar of fire by night to provide light, and a cloud by day to provide them cover from the sun, but also so that way they can see him and he can lead them out into the wilderness. And then, of course, when the Hebrews were leaving, the papyrus also notes gold and lapis lazuli, silver and malachite, carnelian and bronze are fastened on the neck of female slaves. And this coincides with the Exodus account where it says, and they, the Hebrews, requested from the Egyptians silver and gold articles and clothing, and God made the Egyptians favor them, and they granted their request. The Israelites thus drained Egypt of all its wealth. So again, really interesting how a couple of those parallels line up. Like I said, definitely read the full Exodus and read more of this Ipuwer Papyrus, because it's really interesting. So now hopping on over to the Pilate Stone and Pilate's Ring. If you guys have never heard of that, the Pilate Stone was discovered in 1961. It was dated between 26 and 37 AD. The significance of that is Jesus was alive between Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, and from the biblical account, it talks about Pilate, who was the governor of Judea at the time, who was the one who who turned Jesus back over to the Hebrews, who inevitably ended up crucifying him. The significance with this is for many, many years, a lot of people who were just not necessarily anti-Christian, but believe Christianity was just all make-believe, claimed that there was no proof that Pilate was a real historical person, and this, along with his ring, which we're going to get into, completely dismantles that whole argument. So on the Pilate Stone, there's a partial inscription, and it reads, "To the divine Augusti Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, has dedicated this." And this is perfect. It's interesting how that section survived, because it confirms a couple of things. It confirms Pontius Pilate as being a real person. It also confirms him as being prefect of Judea, which is, again, something that was historically recorded in the Bible account. And it also talks about Augusti Tiberium, who was the emperor of the region at that time, if I'm not mistaken. I might have that part mixed up. But again, this stone confirms those biblical accounts, and it confirms that he was a real person, and he wasn't just a made up governor to go along with the story. So then about 7 years later, in 1968, Pilate's ring was discovered, and it's approximately 2,000 years old, and there's an inscription where the inscription on the ring says Pilato, which again was another name for Pontius Pilate at the time. All right, and then next up, we have the Taylor Prism and the Seal of Hezekiah. So the Seal of Hezekiah was discovered in 2009. It's dated to 716 to 686 BC. It was found near the Temple Mount, and it has an inscription on it that says, "Belonging to Hezekiah, son of Ahaz, king of Judah." The significance of this is it confirms that there was a historical king in Judah named Hezekiah, which coincides again with the biblical account of King Hezekiah. Now, one thing for the people who are watching this on YouTube, this little arrow right here, if you notice on the seal, there's a little Egyptian symbol. It's the Ankh. What's interesting with that is it also shows that the Hebrews were starting to adopt cultural symbols and things of the time that the Egyptians were doing, and some of the pagan symbols that the Egyptians were using, which coincides as well with God telling the Israelites not to basically mingle with the other societies and the cultures around them. Inevitably, they didn't listen, and now we see those other influences creeping in to their culture, which is, again, one of the reasons why God was upset with the Israelites. And that's a conversation for later. So moving on now to the Taylor Prism. It was discovered in 1830. It was dated to 690 BC, and it confirmed the prism confirmed the biblical narrative of a King Hezekiah of Judah, and it also confirmed the existence of King Sennacherib of Assyria and his attack on Jerusalem during Hezekiah's reign. And that's something we're going to look at here. So on the prism, the inscription says, "As for the king of Judah, Hezekiah, who had not submitted to my authority, I besieged and captured 46 of his fortified cities, along with many smaller towns, taken in battle with my battering rams. Now, the biblical parallels that the Taylor Prism confirmed would be 2 Kings 18:1, where it says, "Now it came about in the 3rd year of Hoshea, the son of Elah, king of Israel, that Hezekiah, the son of Ahaz, king of Judah, became king." And then 1 Chronicles 32:1, "These acts of faithfulness, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came and invaded Judah and besieged the fortified cities and thought to break into them for himself." What's cool with that Taylor Prism is, again, so now you have something, a culture outside of the Hebrew culture and the Israelite culture, confirming the historical narrative of the king and of the war and the attack on the cities that took place. So moving right along now to another great find is the Moabite stone. So the Moabite stone was discovered in 1868. It was dated to about 840 BC. It confirms a couple of things. Number one, it confirms Omri was king of Israel at that time. It confirms that King Mesha existed, who ruled the Moabites. And it also confirms that the Moabites worshipped a god called Chemosh. And it also confirms Israel worshipped Yahweh, right? God the Father, for us Christians, Yahweh. So this is going to be a reading now from the Moabite stone. "I am Mesha, the son of Chemosh, the king of Moab. Omri was the king of Israel, and he oppressed Moab for many days. For Chemosh was angry with his land, and his son succeeded him. And he said, 'He too, I will oppress Moab. In my days he did so, but I looked down on him and on his house, and Israel has gone to ruin. Yes, it has gone to ruin forever.'" And now the biblical parallel of that is 1 Kings 16:23. "In the 31st year of Asa, king of Judah, Omri became king over Israel and reigned 12 years. He reigned 6 years at Tirzah." 2 Kings 3:4-6. "Now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder and used to pay the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel, and King Jehoram, went out of Samaria at that time and mustered all Israel." Now back to the Moabite stone. "And the men of God lived in the land of Ataroth from ancient times." This coincides again with the Bible, Numbers 32-34. "The sons of Gad built Dibon and Ataroth and Aror." Now back from the Moabite stone. "From there I took the vessels of Yahweh," which confirms a biblical account. The entire Old Testament name for God is Yahweh, the God of Israel. Now moving on to something really, really cool, but not the coolest in this discussion. So the Nazareth House. So in 2008, there was an author named Renee Sam, who claimed to have destroyed Christianity with his book, The Myth of Nazareth, the Invented Town of Jesus. So in his book, he claims Jesus could never have existed because there was no town of Nazareth before 70 AD. I just want to take a moment to explain the skeptics here, right? The naysayers are always focusing in on one thing and don't look at the actual totality of the circumstances. Prior to this book, all these other discoveries were made, right? That confirm the biblical narrative of historical events in the region, that confirm, who the Israelites were, who they worshipped, and all these things, right? I think it's fair to conclude that most people just simply ignore the vast majority of evidence, or they focus in on the one singular missing puzzle piece and they focus in on it so hard that they just completely miss everything. Case in point, right? So, upon reading the book, God says, "Hold my wine cup." And then in 2009, the Nazareth House was discovered in an area historically known to be Nazareth. And the house itself, and it's not just one house, it's multiple houses that were discovered, were dated to the 1st century. So if you don't think God has a sense of humor, here's a good example. Imagine writing this book a year prior to the discovery of something that completely shatters your worldview. Fantastic. So, so reading on now, the significance of this discovery is it proves that Nazareth did exist and was inhabited since the 1st century. This house was one of many discovered along with other structures and artifacts pointing to Hebrew occupation since the 1st century. Now, this particular house, being Jesus's, is up for debate, and there is no hard or conclusive evidence that this specific one that they had found is Jesus's. And one thing I just want to make note of before we continue on is, and I know the book was written a long time ago, but it's an important point to note. The author, René Salome, was not even a scholar or historian. So, he writes these grand claims and says that other scholars have a Christian bias. Like the mental gymnastics some will hop through to avoid Jesus or to avoid acknowledging that maybe you may not believe all of the Bible, but you have to give credit where credit is due, that some of these historical events are recorded accurately. The amount of mental gymnastics people hop through to avoid it is unreal. And it's not just, and I just bring, this book up as an example, but there's many books and there's many things written now in our modern time that follow this same path where people just come out and make these grand claims against Christ or against Christianity, and they're not really backed up by anything but people wanting to believe it to be not true. They just run with it, and then the misinformation spreads and it just gets wildly out of control. But anyway, I digress. So we're going to hop in now to the Pool of Salome. See what I did there? So discovered in 2004, dated from 715 to 687 BC, it was found in an area historically known to be the ancient city of David. The significance of this is it confirms the accuracy of John 9:5-7, 5 through 7, which states, "While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. When he had said this, he spat on the ground and made clay of the spittle and applied the clay to his eyes and said to him, 'Go, wash in the pool of Salome,' which is translated sent. So he went and washed and he came back seeing." So for those of you who don't know, this is a writing describing Jesus healing the sight of a man who was blind since birth. So a couple of important things with the pool is, number one, it confirms the accuracy of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, where King Hezekiah actually built the pool. The reason for building the pool was it was to leave invading armies without water. So this pool ended up replacing a different, more well-known spring that Hezekiah ended up blocking up, so his enemies couldn't have water and sustain their armies. The other significant point with this is, for a blind man to find the pool and to wash in it and be healed means it would have had to been like a common gathering place, a place where he has gone to many times and is able to find his way. So now the last artifact for this, which is probably one of the most wildest and controversial, is the discovery of crucifixion nails, and we'll get into why it's controversial towards the end of here. So a heel bone and a nail were discovered in 1968, and then just a nail was discovered in 1990. Okay, so a nail going through a heel bone discovered in 1968, and then just the nails 1990. All of them were dated to the 1st century. The nails were found in what's called an ossuary with the name Capheus inscribed on it. So what an ossuary is just a ceremonial burial box that the Hebrews used. It's a bone box where they, put the bones of their dead. Now, Capheus, that inscription on this particular bone box is of some major significance, because for those of you who don't know, Capheus was the high priest who condemned Jesus to crucifixion, as is talked about in Matthew 26:3-4, where it reads, "Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Capheus, and they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and to kill him." So the nails have traces of bone fragment and wood on them, And when I say the nails, I mean just the nails without the heel bone. So those nails themselves, the bare nails, do have traces of the bone fragment and wood. This proves that the Romans were crucifying people in the 1st century, which a lot of people like to deny or claim it is a false statement, which is not true, and there's proof of it. There's hard archaeological evidence and proof that they were crucifying people since the 1st century, which again parallels and coincides with the gospel account of Christ being crucified in the 1st century, and also the chief priest who was in charge who condemned him to death. Now, I do want to point out that the heel bone, like the nails themselves and the heel bones belonging to Jesus, is heavily debated, and there's no hard proof that they belong to Jesus. I myself am kind of on the fence because there is a lot of open-endedness. Is it Christ's? Is it not? I've heard a couple of different arguments, and I'm on the fence with it. So again, there's no proof that these particular nails and that heel bone belong to Christ. But the find is extremely significant for the reasons I had mentioned. Now, one other thing I want to mention too is the controversy here is there's a group in Israel called the IAA, which is the Israel Antiquities Authority. They're in charge of basically, running these archaeological digs, finding their historical artifacts, documenting them, this, that, and the other, right? What was interesting, though, is every time an artifact is discovered, it's photographed, there's a sketch, and there's a, very detailed description of, where the artifacts are placed, where they were laying in the area that they were found. But the original report, for some reason, didn't document the nails well, not compared to the other artifacts that were found in the same tomb. And they were actually missing for a while. Every other item in the tomb was photographed and sketched and listed, but the nails were the only ones that were listed but had no sketch and had no photographs, which is very interesting. That would happen, especially because they were found alongside with the bones, the ossuary boxes, and a couple other things. And of course, conveniently, everything else was perfectly sketched, photographed, following, their policy, their procedure, whatever that may be. But the nails themselves were only listed, excuse me. So very interesting, food for thought. And I just want to, on that note, I just want to leave you guys with this. One key aspect I look at too, as far as my belief in Jesus and in Christianity overall, man, people are trying really, really hard to dismantle something that they think is a fable, A, and B, there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of people threatened by a supposed fictional character, but I mean, I'm just going to leave it at that. So as always, man, I hope you guys enjoyed this. If you have any, again, comments, questions, feel free to reach out. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you at the next one. God bless you all.